Hi, Kevin Blanch. I want to read the last chapter of my book, Post-Ignorance. I've been waiting for a long time for this backdrop. It has huge metaphorical significance. That's Ben Lomond Peak right here. I want to show you something. I'm going to read my last chapter, well, one chapter, Radical Conservatism, and an introduction to my big, broader book. And I'm going to expose the freednickers who started the Federal Reserve, the CCC, the WPA right here, who created the strongest middle class in world history. I want to show you something. Look at the name on the side of that crane. Grant McKay. As I'm going to talk a lot about Fawn McKay. I'm going to talk a lot about David O. McKay, the second president, and the Eccleses. They came here from the slums of Glasgow, Scotland, and became the economic powerhouses as Mariner Eccles, the Federal Reserve Building's named after him, my mentor, who raised me, who brought me up, who taught me in my town right here. This building has huge significance. As I told the guy, turn it out, I just had a conversation. Are you one of the McKays? You look just like, oh yeah. We had that. I says, it's ironic you're tearing this down. We talked about Fawn as she taught here as a young professor right here. David McKay, the second president. As I said, Mariner Eccles, that Ben Lomond Peak is named after. The freednickers, and not freednickers free thinking, as you take liberties. That is wrong. Freednickers, as in fleeing impoverished conditions. As his autographed copy of his book is right there in the Stewart Library. He calls himself the Great Socialist, as he was next FDR. And I will prove that the 1905 Masonic Temple, that Leslie Hodgson, the great magnificent Art Deco architect who designed all of this, Ogden High School, the 1905 Masonic Temple, as I hand chisel and single-handedly restored, I will prove that that is the most significant building in the western United States. Maybe the Mormon Temple, even more than that. And the CCC, the WPA, the greatest, strongest middle class in the history of the world, was born here, right here, right here. And I think this is a great backdrop as they're tearing down the Promontory Tower. And I'm going to read my book right now on the mighty Wasatch, on the camper of Weber State, as I'm fighting for my life leukemia. As Mariner Eccles, my mentor, I will prove that he created the strongest middle class in the history of the world right here in this town, my town. The Brownings, I will prove they were selling to both sides. As they came from the slums of Glasgow, Scotland, the Eccles became the richest family maybe in the world, definitely the most powerful by far, and Greenspan kidnapped her. I'll expose it in my book, and I'm going to read this chapter out of my book right now with my old tripod. Let's see what kind of a backdrop we got there. My book, Post-Ignorance. This is going to give the intro to my big, broader book called The Ballad of Cement. Look what I used for a bookmark. That's Bobby Kennedy right here in this building. As I shook his hand in 1968, 100 days before he was assassinated, the end of the Great Progressive Movement, this was the Great Progressive Town. Mount Ogden, Golden Gate had nothing on this park. This was the powerhouse town. This was the home of Waters Construction, right on this very ground I sit. That built Hoover Dam, the biggest construction company on earth. Browning, as they invented the machine gun and transformed freaking Europe. I will get into that. I'll have them mad at me when I get done reading this. But Mariner, as the Treasury building's named after, or excuse me, the Federal Reserve's named after him. I will prove that it was a site called Freednickers. It's ironic that the 1915 Robert Hinckley building is being torn down exactly right now on 28th and Washington Boulevard, right now. But I'm going to read this chapter out of a book. It's called Radical Conservatism. This is in my foundation book, as I wrote this before I got leukemia. Hairspray and makeup, tiny sex organs. I hate Congress. I hate them all. Who is your congressman or woman? Drool, stutter, blah, blah, blah. I'm a neo-ignorant idiot with an opinion of no substance whatsoever. If you do not think this country has reached a long time ago extreme radical conservatives, think again. Again, this is not commentary. This is documentary. And rants, science fiction philosophy. in our monetary system, NAFTA and Extra A, extreme radical free global philosophy that has come true, religious 12th century holy wars with 580 billion a year from one country. Politics turn into pure religion, literally. Karl Rove, radical philosophy works. By the way, ALEC having their convention right now as I sit here at the Grand America in Salt Lake right up the road. The lowest tax rate in United States history, highest incarceration rate in world history, 1 in every 180 in jail in the U.S. Legal to take a gun into a university or any public lands. AK-47, yes, the cheap Russian machine gun in millions of Americans' hands. The U.S. major export, grain, raw iron ore, coal. No, I'm not talking about 1970 Russia. Technology will kill us all. The premeditated death of the technology revolution, back to the cave. Lowest deductive thinking test scores in over 100 years. Lowest IQ scores in U.S. history. Leaders forced to use the word folk so the contemporary understand them. Less than 1% of Americans can find Minnesota on a map or name even 2 Supreme Court justices. This has all happened before. Read what happened to Darwin. Read what happened to Michelangelo. It is true the so-called two-beater U.S. and United States Vice President candidate tried to remove Darwin and other books from Wasilla Library. Palin. Think about that. We have stepped back in time 240 years. We have become everything we fought to escape. We are 1770 jolly old England. We fought the Revolutionary War to escape a society that was ruled by the one religious belief and the controlled via the sword, everyone's path from birth. In 1961, Dwight Eisenhower gave a speech, a much talked about speech for decades, but now, the beware of the industrialized military complex. If you do not believe this warning has come true, you are neo-ignorant and naive. Our military is massive, giant. It is a major industry, and it is the major industry in this country, bar none, nothing else even close. Hypothesize this, the government is, as the Debt Commission has recommended, cuts the military by 10 to 15%. Our unemployment rate in the U.S. is not 9.7 as the extremely misleading propaganda number, what you want to believe. The real number is well over 20%, and I can and will prove it. So let's use the government number. With just a 10% military reduction, the unemployment jumps to over 20%. Multiple effects. Pete. Why did Eisenhower warn us? Because of the incentive to keep wars alive and ongoing. We have a huge incentive to be at war. It is the only thing that we have in regard to our economy. The only export is troops. We make nothing here. We as taxpayers, even if you have a very low paying job, which over 70% of America are underemployed, you pay taxes, not through income taxes, through usury taxes. A vast majority of our tax load is collected via purchase of goods or services. All bare existence has a tremendous tax path. So as taxpayers, all of us, we bailed out GM. The same people we saved are back in business. Their IPO just went $34 a share, but the way a closed offering. They weighed a closed offering. In reality, it was not a public offering. Only the institutions got it in the pre-market. If you wanted it, you had to buy it in the open market. Think about it. You still own it in theory. You're an American taxpayer. The American taxpayer still owns the biggest stake of, and are the biggest shareholders. Remember, I wrote this 2 years ago. Where is your seat on the board? That is how the corporate structure works in this country by law. So we save them. And in return, they do the same thing they have done for over 20 years now, send our jobs to China. So in a very sick way, we send money to the so-called commies we fought and died for decades. That number always bothered me, 4, the number 4. GM is the #1 automaker in China. They say they're number 4 here. The entire world-class economy in decline for 30 years. That's right, 30 years, not 2 or 3. Please, no 4. The real wages in the middle class have been a dramatic decline for 30 years. If you think that is a random, think again. You are neo-ignorant. The election of Ronald Reagan set the wheels in motion. One of the first things he did was fire the air traffic controllers, breaking the union in and against Feds, so-called wink, and only the enforce the laws and a nod. What was the great quote? One of the all-time favorites, there is no wrong or right, there's only popular opinion. Jeffrey, 12 Monkeys borrowed it. My ex-girlfriend liked to say to me, calm down, Jeffrey. I think she was dreaming. I look like that she did. I look back on that, she did close her eyes a lot. I believe it was Booker T. Washington who said it. I think it was Mark Twain. I have to caveat that. I could be wrong. It was the start of the major philosophical in reality shift. We had the strongest middle class in world history from 1945 to 1980. That is a fact. I will prove that the strongest middle class in the history of the world, the most socialist country in the history of the world, was all based right here in this town, and it was all based by one man who was using Keynesian economics long. I like to say he was to John Maynard Keynes what Lou Gehrig was to Babe Ruth. He was using an Ethereum practice. Mariner, Eccles, right here, this town, right here, that mountain. The Federal Reserve policies were set in motion by Mariner Eccles of my home, Ogden, Utah, a Mason, a very close working partner of another Mason, FDR. They were like this. His famous story goes, the first call I was made to Mariner when I knew he was going to become president. And Mariner's famous quote was, you know, as FDR used to say, I'm a traitor to my class. And Mariner would say, if FDR's a traitor to his class, what am I? Because he was maybe the richest man in the world. He started the IMF. He started the World Bank. They were the biggest holding company in the world. The Federal Reserve Building is named after the entire Fed charter, the entire restructure. He would roll over in his grave as he called himself the great socialist, as the great Anne Rander kidnapped it. And it was his nephew that was in line to get the job in '87, right here, District 12. And I write about that in my bigger, broader book, The Ballad of Cement. I honestly believe the 1905 Masonic Temple that I had just personally restored is one of the most important buildings in American history, and no one even knows it is there. Mariner Eccles was involved in Ogden in a secret society called Freednickers. Last chapter of this book is called Freednickers and Masons. A very powerful society with the likes of the Browning fortune, which invented the automatic gun, just feet away from the said temple. The invention by John Browning of Ogden, Utah, transformed the entire world. WW2 won. The French were still marching in purple plumes and red vests in order. The Germans had machine guns invented here in Ogden, Utah, and sold to the Germans by the Brownies here in Ogden, Utah. It is very important for Americans to understand during the Great European War, 1914 to 1918, 1818, there was Lodge 18, go Scots. Ben Lomond High School right there named the Ben Lomond Scots. That's what kind of power the McKays and the Eccles had in this town, especially the Eccles Mariner. To name a high school, the Scots, after an ethnic group. We're not talking in 1852. We're talking in 1960. The United States was evolving heavily in selling all kinds of things to the Europeans. The Europeans were committed to that war, and their resources, human and natural, were in the war machine. So it was the United States businessmen selling everything from food to clothing to machine guns. In Ogden, Utah, in the 1890s and 1930s, two of the greatest wealth empires in American history were born, world history. One from the slums of Glasgow, Scotland. The other from the John Browning and David Eccles early Mormon niggers who started from nothing, and I mean nothing. It is important to note that the family of David O. McKay's grandfather of Alan Ashton, who I talked about in the chapter before, and the Eccles came to Utah together from Scotland, 1818, grew financial empires fast. David Eccles living in the mountains above Ogden's Grand Peaks, nearly freezing to death. Right there. On the other side of those mountains. Sleeping with his family, curled up next to the last ox, trying to survive. Sleeping so they would not freeze to death. As the family curled up next to the ox, trying to survive, went to Oregon and made a timber company. You got to remember, this was the Junction City right here. It was the only rail lines. This vast natural resource. He built a line. In fact, they were robber barons. They just cut trees and took what they want. He had the rail lines to get timber to market. This vast, gigantic, one of the richest natural resources in the history of the world right here. The Golden Spike was driven right there. The Junction City right here, this town. Timber got as sparked as he needed. He grew his business fast. He started to build the West infrastructure. His brilliant young son from his second wife. Yeah, he was Mormons, and he says in his book, David Eccles says, when they came through the Mormon missionaries come through the slums of Scotland, he says it like this. He says, I didn't believe a word they said, but I knew it had to be better than this. With two wives, was sleeping in a tent. This is Mariner, his son. He was sleeping in a tent in Hiram, Utah, which is up the canyon, one of the coldest places in the United States when his father suddenly died. Mariner took over. A huge fight pursued over the next few years, which is common in Utah. My family to this day, who are like the Eccles and the Brownies, early First Mormon Europeans with more than one wife, the Eccles fight over their father's estate went on. You want to talk about family fights? We're talking more than one wife involved. It really got complicated, but he was brilliant. He was smart. Mariner, he, like a great athlete, let the others aggressively fight. He would use his brain to compete. He won out. He took his father's young fortune and parlayed it into the banking giant of the First Security, among others, right here in Ogden, like the Browning fortune and the Wattis fortune. Those are Wattis buildings, all named that. Utah Construction started right here where I'm sitting, who built Hoover Dam. To this day is the biggest construction company in the world. In 1971, they sold to GE made millionaires everywhere right here where I'm sitting. These buildings are all named after them. The Phyllis Wattis MoMA in San Francisco, they didn't leave till Ogden till 1960s. That's them right here. And the D fortune, Thomas D, our great hospitals, that gigantic fortune that was made in the canning business. And on and on 18 of them, as they were similar to the Roosevelt fortune. In the early part of the 20th century, the class system still reigned. Wealth married wealth. They lived together, they worked together, they bred together. So it was natural migration for the two said fortunes to merge, via Mariner's offspring. The synergy was of wealth in the great railroad junction city was powerful, very powerful, as was the Roosevelt fortune. Remember, Roosevelt, Teddy, it was his offspring, was Eleanor. FDR was married to his second cousin, and she was directly the man who started the progressive movement, Teddy Roosevelt. She was not, I mean, he was related to FDR, but he was directly related to FDR's wife. Yeah, they were second cousins. Remember, Franklin's wife was his second cousin. Much like the ruling families in the European continent, they were all related and they bred together. There were other young fortunes being made in Ogden. They all members of the Freeknicker secret society. When the FDR won the election in 1932 on the back of the so-called free market economy, FDR turned to the financial powers of the country, his fellow Masons. And right here over the hill, Teddy used to come to this town all the time. And as I spoke about Mr. Hinckley, Robert Hinckley, he would stay at his ranch right up there. There's pictures of they would stay there. They had a place, that's Eden. It's called Eden up there. It's beautiful up there. They called it the Garden of Eden. That's where he would stay. They had very close ties. A fellow Mason through Lodge 18 here in the building I speak of. It is not a coincidence that the currency in the 1930s were all reconfigured and the bills are Masonic bills. Again, another Mason friend of Mariner FDR. And I can get into the guy that redid all the dollar bills as serious roots right here. I want to show you this as I typed this in. I made this little thing about Mariner. You could see Idaho, Wyoming. I'll flip the page, Arizona, Nevada, as I made it look like the state of Utah. Mariner Eccles had been exploring economic theory in his Masonic mind. Somehow, the very strange thinking English of the time, they think they have to be the fathers of all intellectual thinking and kidnap Mariner Eccles' economic theory. Let this be said, no how, no way was John Maynard Keynes the father of demand-side called Keynesian economics. As I like to say, Mariner was using it. You know, he was talking about it, Keynes. I don't even think Mariner had even read anything about it. You know, I don't know that they even knew each other that well, or I don't think they even knew each other. I can't find any proof of it in my research. As I say, it was what Lou Gehrig was to Babe Ruth, but it was Mariner using it in practice here, not Keynes. So they take credit for it. Mariner really deserves the credit for it here. He is the father of demand-side economics. Him, as he created the strongest middle class in world history, the great socialist he called himself. I find it to be a great slap in the face of all Americans, especially Utahns. Mariner was the father that is in non-debatable fact. And Eccles and FDR went to work with the Masonic plan right out of Mariner's brain, hatched, I believe, in the said Masonic temple in Ogden, which I have for years been ranting and raving about, and no one, I mean no one, will listen to me. The building was condemned in the 1980s. A very creepy Ogden cheapskate businessman bought it for peanuts. The homeless were living in it. I begged him to let me restore it in those days. My stucco plaster business, Kevin Blanch Plastering, I would bid every project that came along. The sickening neocon city and owner at the project that came along, the sickening neocon owner at the time of the historical building were deaf. They did not even know who Mariner Eccles was. Also, it must be said that I believe the greatest Art Deco architect in American history, Mariner's friend, fellow Mason Leslie Hodson, designed the said building as He was only 1905. The Masonic Temple was his very first project. He did Ogden High, you know, West High School. I could go on, and all these grand buildings. As Mariner was just throwing money at him, and I mean, we're going to Ogden High. I'll write a whole chapter about that, as it is gilded in gold. The auditorium is gilded in gold. It's being restored right now as they pulled it apart. I mean, it's literally gilded in gold. It is the most amazing high school in the world, and no doubt. They say it's the greatest auditorium in the United States, and it's in a high school, right here. Well, Leslie Hodson was a young man when he did the 1905, and this creepy guy I'm talking about, they wanted to condemn it. I stopped it from the wrecking ball. I got him money to have it restored, and then he stabbed me in the back and hired this Capitol building, this synthetic junk. They ruined it, totaled it out. But I'll get back to that. I did save it. I hung off a rope and hand chiseled it in 2009. It's 12 hours a day, 7 days a week for 4 months, and I hand chiseled and I brought it back to its magnet. I worked off a photograph from the 1917 archives I found of the parade, the 1918 World War I parade, right there, and I matched it perfectly. The sick New York City at the time that the project came along, the historic building were deaf. They did not hear a thing I said. Also, it must be said that I believe the greatest Art Deco, Mariner's friend, Leslie Hodson, who I just talked about, had designed the said building. 18 of us, his very young man, the first project. I knew all of this. I did a very strange thing in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I knew of all this. I did a very strange thing. The creepy owner found some low, non-skilled losers and the great destroyers of Ogden great history. And I want to talk about this right now. That mountain right behind there is Ben Lomond Peak, and that's where I always do my videos, out there by the pond. And there's a reason, because of Mariner and the economic significance to that, and it's beautiful. But that is the majestic mountain of Paramount Pictures. William Hodgkins owned the Orpheum Theater, as Charlie Chapman and so many of, you know, the Marx Brothers, all of them, you know, it's many of them said it was their favorite theater program. It was still there when I was a kid. In the 80s, it was the first building on the historical site. Well, D. Livingood, old Big D, and the Ben Lomond Hotel, the owner wanted it tore down, so with a wink and a nod, he just threw stuff off the roof as they're remodeling the Ben Lomond, which John Browning's shop set right there, where the machine gun was invented, right there, and collapsed it. That is that building. It was grand, it was magnificent. And like I said, the Marx Brothers, George Burns said it was his favorite place. With the help of a very creepy Capitol building supply selling synthetic fake stucco, this man should be in jail. He would walk by as I was hand chiseling. Me and him would have it out every day. Told me I could never do it, and I'll get into that. He took the bunch of novice know-nothings and spread synthetic paint with sand on it. You do know that is all the so-called synthetic everyone uses in this country is latex paint with sand and that's all it is. The synthetic, I did tons and tons of them. I think that's probably how I got leukemia, is one of the reasons, in the nuclear fallout through my body. Yeah, that's all it is. Synthetic stuff, all it is latex paint with sand. I'm telling you, I make it all the time. Lime and sand in it. He defaced and destroyed the temple. I went into all the simulators. No one cared. I would drive by it every day on my way to the supply yard down Washington Bar, which I had traveled nearly every day my entire life. I was outraged. 18 and 13. You'll see why the numbers, as I like to say. There's the bottom. Arizona, Nevada test site, the Navajo Reservation, which I'll really get into that in my bigger, broader novel on my father. But fate gave the great temple a break. Randy Richards and Bernie Allen bought the old temple and began to restore the interior. I was a derivative trader on Wall Street by then. I found out a couple years later they had bought it. It was an acquaintance. I had done business and had been sued by the likes of Randy Richards and Bernie Allen. I had stuccoed Randy's house like had nearly everyone in Ogden's house. I knew he was a progressive thinker, and he had an old Ogden name and a family history tied to Ogden, like the Blanch name, like the Eccles name, like the Browning name, like his partner Bernie Allen name, ex-mayors, you know, go way back. I knew I had a chance at getting in his ear, so I went to work on him every chance I got. I was an expert witness in many bad EFA stucco cases, and I would direct the owners to Randy for legal counsel. I would tell him, your building is the same as your client's nightmares, the same fake junk. Many homes all over America have been totaled by the neo-ignorant fake stucco over styrofoam. They're all full of mold and rotting from the inside out, just like America's popular pinhead, a giant face full of facade, with their guts nothing but lack of skill, hard work, of learning. The said building has great arch frescoes in it. They have been covered up with a drop ceiling and partially torn out. The exterior had been covered 4 times over its 103-year history. The sandstone Hodson has used had pitted from all the harsh north wind and freezing cycles fairly early in its life, so the plaster contractors in the 30s, by my investigation, panicked and covered the whole thing. Very common in construction history then and now. Recovers have huge margins then and now, and the contractor will always attempt to sell a recover because of the easy profits and high margins. People are always going to tell you, just recover it. It's easy for them to do, and there's a lot of money in them. And, you know, I was a stucco contractor for 30-something years. After a few years of him getting sick of listening to me, they let me at it with one condition. I agreed to wear a harness the entire time. I fell in 2005. Broke my back, severed my tongue, you know, critical then. You know, when I got sick and got leukemia, my aunt and my uncle are both like, how many lives you got? He knew that I had a critical fall in 2005 with extremely critical condition, broken back, severed tongue, scar on the front of this book, and crushed skull, very close to death. Not the first time in my life or the last. I wrote this before I got the real scare of almost dying leukemia. In 2005, 2006, I was in critical condition twice in 1 year. Critical condition, the same doctor treated me in the ER. Here's ironic. The same doctor treated me, he's an asshole, his name's Brown. When I got leukemia and I was in such extreme, same guy, sent me home again. Sent me, oh, this guy should be in prison and jail. I'm going to go after him. His name's Brown. I'm a KD, work in the emergency room. He's a malpractice creep. He almost killed me again. Isn't that ironic? Over a 5-year period, 2000, 2000, I had 5 major accidents or fights that left me in the emergency room. Make it 6.